Hello and welcome to a live Kerfefe break on Deprogram with Keri Smith. I'm your host, Keri. If it's your first time here, this is a live show we do Mondays and Fridays where we just kind of talk about whatever's in the news or what's on our mind. And this is a conversation today I'm having that I've been wanting to have for a while with a friend of the show. You guys may know him as Actual Justice Warrior here on YouTube. His name is Sean Fitzgerald. Please welcome Sean. Hello.
Thank Hello, thank you for having me.
Thanks
Glad
for
to be
coming
here.
back.
Yeah,
I
glad to be back.
I I know everyone's probably doing if they have regular shows, they're probably doing election stuff today, but I don't care. Like, I'm just happy in my state, we kicked Beto's ass yet a third time, so I'm like, that's all I cared about, and now I wanna get to this topic that I've been anxious to discuss with you because it just burns me up, and, um you do a lot of coverage of these. I think I first heard the phrase from you, Sean, innocence fraud cases. Can you describe what you mean with that phrase, innocence fraud?
Well, there's essentially a movement that seeks to undermine the criminal justice system. And for a while, I think they were going to go with the let's be empathetic or sympathetic to the people who are arrested and committed crimes because they're, even though they're criminals, they've been treated too poorly or whatever. But that's not really effective. People are not really interested in that. So, this new tactic is essentially to paint these guilty people as innocent because most good-hearted people don't want to see an innocent person, go to prison, much less face the death penalty. And a lot of this is related to anti-death penalty activism.
Mhm. And what are some of the big ones? I wanna talk to you about Adnan Syed. You've done a number of excellent videos covering that case, and I would say anybody below, there should be a link to your channel there. Anybody who's interested in that or surprised that I think he's guilty. I saw a few friends were like, "Wait a minute, you think he's guilty?" I'm like, "Go watch Sean's videos." But in addition to Adnan Syed, like, what are some of the big ones that you would say, this is sort of an innocence fraud
I
case?
mean, there are a lot of them. Adnan is obviously recently in the news, but I would say overall, like the what I've learned about the Innocence Project has been the most troubling because case after case, what you find out is that the Innocence Project is behind it, and those are the most fraudulent of all the cases. A perfect example of this is Stephen Avery from the Netflix documentary Making a Murderer. Stephen Avery did it. Like, the evidence is overwhelming, and that documentary just leaves out everything that proves beyond any doubt that he did, in fact, do it. And one of the reasons why is because that documentary series is produced by the Innocence Project. Rodney Reed is one out of Texas, another case where they're saying that this guy not only is innocent, but he's the victim of racism, and that's why he was convicted. But you look into the case and you're like, there's overwhelming evidence of guilt, not just in this crime, but 7 other sexual assaults, including one of a 12-year-old. Like the Chino Hills massacre out in California. That's another one. That's Kevin Keith, where they're trying to get that guy out of prison. I haven't even done a video on that one specifically, but you have a guy who killed an entire family, basically, one surviving child, and a neighbor's kid who was sleeping over. And they just manufacture evidence, including somebody who said that they think their boyfriend's behind it based on the fact that they did a seance because they were practicing Wicked. Now, they don't tell you that. They say, oh, no, this is a legitimate witness. Trust us. Don't worry about it. But there's overwhelming evidence in that one, including DNA evidence that ties this man to the killings.
The what you just said about that one and the Stephen Avery one, I mean, I need to go back and read stuff about the Stephen Avery case now because I'm one of those people who watched Making a Murderer and thought this guy is wrongfully convicted. He's completely innocent. I think I even have probably old tweets about it. We need to help free this guy. I was part of the mob, I guess you would say, if like there's an injustice done. Let's correct this. And that's one I just haven't had time to revisit since I formed that opinion. But in the case of
I
Adnan,
would
go
say
ahead.
for Avery, the documentary is very well made. The Netflix series very entertaining. So I understand why watching, because I watched it and I was like, oh wow, this guy looks innocent if you just consume the documentary. But what's really interesting about the Avery case is that he was wrongfully convicted of a sex crime. And there's actually a guy who wrote a book on the Avery sex crime before, the one that he gets out on, that when he committed the murder, he's suing over. And they asked this guy to write a book about the murder case. So after looking into the murder case, he wrote a second book about it, except his second book is explaining why Stephen Avery is definitely guilty of this murder. And one of the key things left out of the documentary is the fact that his sweat DNA was underneath the latch of her vehicle. So he had been under the hood of this car. And he says that she never showed up to the place until witnesses place her at his little junkyard. Then he changes that story. There's also a series of Star 69 calls where he's getting her to come to the property. And then after she leaves, there's a call without Star 69, which is his alibi call, where he's calling to say that she didn't show up. Now, when you realize other witnesses place her there at the time, that other call is so damning because it's his alibi call. So there's a ton of evidence against Stephen Avery, but the sweat DNA, considering you can't plant that, is something that they can't address. And the fact that 206 of her bones were found on the Avery property, and these were smashed up into fragments. There's no way somebody could have framed and grabbed all of her bones and brought them to the property.
That kind of stuff, like, I definitely want to read more about this one now, because when I started reading, I'm going to talk about one I do know a little more about that you've covered, the Adnan Syed. When I started reading stuff about that case after listening to Serial, I was like a lot of people, I got swept up in the Serial podcast. Although from what I recall at that time, unlike Avery, I think I thought he did it. I'm trying to remember exactly, but I was pretty sure there were things that made me think he was maybe a sociopath and had done it. But when I started reading more about it, when this push to really free him kicked into overdrive, I would say, I watched some of your videos, I read some other stuff, and then I finally watched they did an HBO documentary, and it was called The Case Against Adnan Syed. And having read a lot before watching that, then it was very clear while watching that recently how much they were leaving out. It's like they called it The Case Against Adnan Syed, but they never even presented the case. Like, they didn't show any of the evidence that would show that he's guilty. They made the opposite case and then just purposefully left stuff out. Here's a good example. That letter, and you talk about this, that letter that she wrote him, that was basically, dude, I broke up with you. You're creeping me out. Kind of, I'm paraphrasing here, but she's like, you're taking this way too seriously. You're being too intense. You're really starting to bother me. Leave me alone. She wrote him this letter after breaking up with him. And they mention that letter in the series. They leave out completely the fact that in his handwriting at the top of the letter, he wrote, I am going to kill.
Yeah.
They just don't even say it.
They leave out his response to the letter, and they bring in some quote unquote friend who knows that when somebody went to the high school to say, I think Hay was just feeling a little bad that day, or some kind of thing to downplay it. But she's clearly saying, like, people break up all the time. You're clearly showing no respect for me. They leave out testimony from other teachers at the school saying that there were points where Hay wanted to be hidden from this guy. And it's all to downplay the fact that he was really upset about the breakup, because he was. And Serial is very much a propaganda piece. Like, they get the story from Rabia. All of the Adnan Syed is innocent stuff comes from Rabia, who's Adnan's best friend's older sister and has become a multimillionaire based on this case. But like at least the Serial documentary didn't 100% dismiss this. They did portray the fact that Adnan was a jealous ex-lover, because that's exactly what he was.
Yes. One of the other most damning things I think that they tend to leave out, the innocence people, is they try to make this case, and Sarah Koenig, is that how you say it? She tried to do this in Serial, where they're sort of saying, well, the reason that Adnan can't, recall what he did that day, the day that she disappeared and was killed, the reason he can't recall what he was doing that day is because, he was questioned 6 weeks later, and it's just an ordinary day. It's hard for any of us to remember what we were doing 6 weeks ago on a specific day if it was an ordinary day. And listening to that, even I was like, I do remember being like, oh yeah, that's a good point. How could you remember? Because I have a very, very bad memory. But then you come to find out what they don't like to talk about is it wasn't an ordinary day. He was questioned by the police that day. They called him and you know, your girlfriend's missing. That would bring everything into focus that day. What happened
Yeah,
today?
it's the day that his first love that he just that just started dating somebody else 13 days prior went missing, and a detective called him, and he told the detective that he was supposed to get a ride from her after school, making him the last person to see her alive. Which all of a sudden he doesn't remember saying that, or doesn't remember the ride, or and all that. So he also didn't show up for school that day. It was his friend's birthday, the day that his friend Stephanie's birthday. And Adnan claims that he left school randomly to go to Stephanie's boyfriend's house to make sure Stephanie's boyfriend got his own girlfriend a gift. So, like, this is all unusual stuff, but he doesn't remember anything about that day because he doesn't want to get tied down to any story that can be refuted later, which makes sense when you think about the trial because they went through multiple alibis in the early stages of the trial.
You pointed that out. I remember one of your videos, you talk about how at one point he was trying to say, well, I was at the mosque. And so they actually had that they had 40 people who were
Oh, it's
willing,
80.
it was 80 who were willing to testify at first, who signed a letter saying, yeah, we saw him at the mosque. And then none of them would go, none of them actually perjured themselves and would go up there and say that because he wasn't at the mosque.
Yeah, it's a pre-trial motion, like indicating that the defense is going to call these witnesses to testify. And after they presented the cell phone data, or after the defense attorney was aware of the cell phone data, they withdrew 80 alibi witnesses all at once. And like this is totally not mentioned, completely ignored in any of the Adnan Syed propaganda, even though I pull up the exact transcript of this portion of the pretrial like memos, and they are going based on the defense's file, so they definitely have it. They're just choosing not to air it because 80 people in the community willing to lie for their boy doesn't look good on the community, especially when they're trying to smear the Korean community in order to undermine Hay and all of them and her family.
Yeah. Can we talk about that cell phone data for a second? Because that's one of the big things that the people who, I find that a lot of people, and this is just a human thing, once they maybe listen to Serial or something that emotionally helps us come to an opinion, then they'll start hearing facts. Especially if they get into one of these communities where they're now advocating on behalf of the innocents because they were emotionally swayed, they will only see, as we've mentioned, they'll only see the stuff that points towards innocence, and they won't see in that echo chamber the things that point towards guilt. And so one of the things that I've seen the people in that innocence echo chamber will say is, hey, the cell phone evidence wasn't reliable, that incoming calls. Okay, so anybody who's not familiar with this case, they were able to track his phone all day and where it was pinging off of cell phone towers. We know how this works, and this is used in a lot of cases now, but back then it was relatively new. And they had several incoming calls that put him at the burial site at the time when she was buried with the witness who said, yes, I was there burying her with him.
Right.
um they have those incoming calls. Then they have an outgoing call from his phone at the car dump site where the
Right
car
at
was dumped
right after. So we're
right
we're
after.
talking maybe 50 minutes apart. So you think about how long it takes to bury somebody in a shallow grave and then drive to a car dump site. Like it lines up perfectly. And to be clear, they have outgoing calls when they're driving in the direction towards the park
Yeah.
as well. So it's like it perfectly fits. But essentially, they found some piece of paper, and I've heard it's related to something to do with billing and subscriptions about how, for this very specific thing, incoming calls aren't as reliable than outgoing calls. But like, this is something that has been adjudicated multiple times. Even on the Serial website, which I point to, they contacted a bunch of experts. They couldn't find a single expert to say that incoming and outgoing data, cell phone location data, is any different scientifically. So this is not a thing. They've brought in an expert to testify in his appeal. He lost this on the appeal. And again, it doesn't undercut the fact that two separate incoming calls, according to their theory, even though Adnan was nowhere near the body dump site, which is Lincoln Park, pinged the Lincoln Park Tower, which covers basically the park and a few other streets, 2 times in a row, like 8 minutes apart, like coincidentally, just randomly.
Coincidentally, that's the crazy part is they want us to believe. I'm like, okay, let's say that you're right. Let's say that for some reason we can't trust the incoming call cell phone location data, but we can trust the outgoing call data. So how do you explain the outgoing call that happens where the car was dumped right after this? How do you explain that? Because you're telling me that this one piece that this fax cover sheet or whatever says we can't trust the incoming, but we can trust the outgoing. And so there's an outgoing call at the car dump site. How do you explain that just coincidentally then, out of all the places his cell phone could have erroneously just pinged, it just
Yeah.
happened to be it just happened to be at the burial site. It could have been at Walmart. It could have been anywhere, Chuck E. Cheese. It was at the burial site just by coincidence.
It could have, and the thing is, if it was the burial site once and then somewhere else for the second call, that would be one thing. But it inadvertently pinged the burial site 2 times in a row within 8 minutes. Like that's very weird. But there's even more than that. Like the cell phone data is like a total canard because even if the even if the incoming data is unreliable, for whatever reason that can't be proven, there's no author to that memo, any expert, even Serial, which is very pro Adnan called, can't confirm this. The outgoing at the car dump site does line up perfectly with the story.
Mhm.
But more importantly, Jay Wilds told people that day
That
that
night.
Adnan had strangled Heyman Lee, and they told the police that. So,
Mhm.
like, you have 3 people that are not Adnan that know that Adnan either killed Heyman Lee or that he killed and strangled her, and him and Jay buried the body. Like, Jen Pusateri said she knew that day
Yeah.
that Jay said that Adnan strangled her and he saw her in the trunk of the car, and then they buried her somewhere. On top of that, there's also the fingerprints evidence on Heyman Lee's maps. So, I don't know if you've heard about this.
Yes. Tell people though about this.
So, this is 1999, so nobody has Google navigation. People used to have paper maps. I know a lot of these young kids in your audience don't know that. And that's how they would find stuff. So they found Adnan's fingerprints on the paper map book, but even more crucially, the page for Lincoln Park was ripped out of the book and Adnan's fingerprints were all over that. So somebody who I guess framed Adnan, according to these people, pulled out the page that matched the burial site and then had Adnan's fingerprints all over that page. And it also lines up with cell phone data and it also lines up with witness testimony, but somehow Adnan is innocent. Like it just makes no sense.
Yeah. I hear a lot from in that because I've been reading stuff in the Innocence echo chamber about this case. And the other thing they say is, well, you can't trust Jay Wilds. You can't trust him because details of his story changed. I know what I think about that, but what's your response to that?
So there are aspects of Jay's story that did change, right? But like the things that are consistent that didn't change are way more important than the things that did change. So the main thing that Jay Wilds was concerned about when he was pulled in by the police back in 1999 was the fact that he was a drug dealer. So in the 90s we had Rockefeller drug laws in New York. Baltimore had something very similar, that you could get a good amount of time for selling drugs. So it is recorded by the police that he stonewalled them on the fact that he was selling drugs. And crucially, he was selling drugs out of his grandmother's house, which is where he lived. So the main detail that he's changed in his story related to this case is where he saw Heyman Lee's body. Now, where he actually saw it and he owns up to it right now is in front of his grandmother's house, which makes sense. Adnan knew where he lived, and that's where you would go to meet Jay. But he didn't want to say that. So he said to his friend that it was in a Best Buy parking lot, or he said to the police it was in a Best Buy parking lot. And then he said to his friend that it was in front of his other friend's house. So that's the key detail that Jay changed. Now, he was stonewalling for a while, pretending he wasn't there, pretending he didn't do nothing, anything like that. But what these people never talk about is that Adnan's story has changed in more crucial
Yes.
ways. And everything that his story changed about are the crucial details. So Adnan asked Heyman Lee for a ride like that day. That's what he told the police that day, that he asked her for a ride. Then he figures out that she
Wait a
went
minute.
missing.
I'm going to interject. He not only told the cops that day when they asked him, "Hey, your girlfriend's missing. Do you know anything?" And he told them, "I asked her for a ride." There were also two friends who corroborated that, who said, "Yeah, I overheard Adnan asking Hay for a ride."
Yes. So he asked for a ride. He's changed that story, saying that he didn't ask her for a ride. He said that he didn't miss. He was at school, and then they look at his attendance and they find out that he's like showing up 45 minutes late to classes. He's missing whole into like all these other classes, and like he was clearly not at school for giant portions of the day. Like he said at times that he wasn't with Jay, but then people place him with Jay, and all of a sudden he was with Jay. And he's like, listen, I just don't remember. So every key detail he has forgotten about, changed his story. He's talked about going to the mosque, and then that was not true. So then he had to change that. And even when you listen to him in the first episode of the Serial podcast, it's absurd because he gets into vagaries about all the crucial times. He like instead of committing to a story, he says, normally I would be here. And then there's the whole thing with the library alibi. Adnan never said he was at the library talking to
Mhm.
what's that, Asia
Aish
McLean.
Asia.
He never said that. And then years later, Asia McLean is coming forward with this alibi, which is very dubious as well. And he's not committing to that, but they're just throwing that out there.
Yeah. I have a question for you from Laura in the chat about the like, why would Jay lie about the location where he saw the body? Why would he not want to admit that it was in front of his grandma's house? She was like, could she have lost her house?
Well, yeah, so he thought, remember Jay's 18, 19 at the time, and he's a drug dealer. So he was worried that his drug dealing would bounce back onto his grandmother. And one of the things that actually caused him to come forward is when the cops were like, "Listen, idiot, we don't care about your drug dealing. Like, we're not prosecuting that. Somebody was murdered." So it was only he was stonewalling the cops completely until they said they didn't care about the drug dealing. And that's like the one detail he kept shifting in, like who he told, because he didn't want it to come out that it was in front of his grandmother's house, because he didn't want them to look into the grandmother's house and find out that he's selling a bunch of pot out of there.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned is that I completely agree with, and that's my response to people too that say you can't trust Jay. I'm like, really? Because the broad strokes of what happened in his story have never changed. And he told, as you mentioned, he told his friend Jen that night after helping bury the body, he told his friend Adnan strangled her. Of course, he didn't tell his friend, and I helped bury her. He tried to minimize his involvement, but he had that friend go with him to where Adnan had dumped the shovel and he went to the trash dump to try to cover up evidence, and that friend was there. Why would he tell? Here's my question for people is why would a person tell someone, "Hey, I helped my friend tonight. He strangled his girlfriend, and I need you to come with me and get rid of this evidence of, where I was with him when he buried her, but I didn't help bury her." And why would he do that unless he was the real killer and was trying to throw suspicion? Like, why would that ever happen? And the thing is, he's not the killer. He has no motive. He has even Rabia, the person who has pushed this whole innocence thing of Syed, she's now tweeting, no, he didn't do it. It wasn't Jay. Well, then if it wasn't Jay, then why would Jay tell a friend that night and other people, Adnan my friend killed his ex-girlfriend, and I saw the
Yeah,
body, and I went with
it,
him to the burial site.
it's even more than that, because Hay's body wasn't found for over a month afterwards. So you have people that know that she strangled a month the day she went missing, and she had only been missing a couple of hours. So she's strangled to death, and people know that. They don't find the body until a month later, and that's something that Jen Pusateri brought to the table when the police brought her in, because they started looking into Adnan's cell phone records based on some anonymous tips that they got, and they found out that he was unusually calling her multiple times that day. So they bring her in. She comes in with her parents and a lawyer. They give that information that they were withholding, that Hay was strangled, and that's how they stumble onto Jay. So this idea that Jay is shady, right? But that's the thing. Adnan picked his shadiest friend to help him cover up a murder. Like, there's a great line from the district attorney where he's like, we don't get to choose who Adnan's accomplice is. Adnan chose who his accomplice was. So yeah, like there's he's not a bright guy. He's not a smart guy. He's like changing his story about things that in the grand scheme of things don't matter, but he's an 18-year-old kid at the time really worried about drug dealing.
Yeah. I had another question for you. It's a super chat, actually. Thank you. Pirate Tomsky for the 10 pounds says, hi, Sean. What do you think about the lawyer content creators who have popped up recently covering cases in real time? They did a lot to debunk the narrative around Rittenhouse in the mainstream media.
I mean, there's like a point where the trial becomes entertainment, and I'm not super interested. Like, I'm not very into that because it's a little. I feel a little uneasy about that becoming straight up entertainment. But LawTube watching the Rittenhouse trial and reacting to how bad the prosecution's case was got so much attention that I do think it flipped more people than, my videos ever could. Because I put out a video probably 2 days after the Rittenhouse shooting based on what we saw, and I was like, this is a clear and obvious case of self-defense, but, I've limited circulation, and it's not the same as, like, a stream with a bunch of LawTube guys that's getting hundreds of thousands of views reviewing it in real time. And not everybody's gonna watch the trial, but they might watch or follow one of their favorite content creators. And when you had so much misinformation about the Rittenhouse case out there, it's just nice that people were putting out what was actually happening.
Mm-hmm. What did you follow? I think you did. I think we even talked about it on this show a little bit. Maybe the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp, same kind of thing. I think that attention that it was getting in real time may have helped some people to see, like, hey, the whole idea of hashtag believe all women has some serious flaws.
I mean, that was like a whole other monster. It was, that was so beyond even LawTube. It was like everybody was memeing that case. It was ridiculous. That was a crazy show. It
Yeah.
was just insane.
Yeah. So with the Adnan Syed case, so Rabia Chaudhry, who I learned about through this case and partially through your videos and stuff, she is now launched off the back of this successful campaign to get him released. Oh wait, before we go there, one final thing. I keep seeing the people in the Innocence echo chamber are like, the DNA evidence just cleared him. The DNA evidence cleared him. And if I ask some of those people, do you know what was tested for DNA? Can you tell me what the specifics of what cleared him? They don't know. Can you tell people what it was?
So I want to talk about the Brady violations
Okay.
too. But
Okay.
yeah, so this case is not a DNA case, and I know a lot of people watch, Law and Order, Forensic Files, whatever show, CSI, and they think that, oh, like all these cases are solved by some like intricate piece of forensic evidence. 92% of cases have no DNA evidence. So what they did, and sometimes this can be effective, is they decided to test some stuff related to Heyman Lee and what was in her car and what was on her body for touch DNA. Now, because she was left out in the woods and she wasn't found until a month later, any touch DNA would have degraded off of her body and off of her clothes at the time, way back in 1999. But we also didn't know touch DNA really existed in 1999. So none of this stuff was tested for that. So they tested her clothes that she was wearing using modern technology, and they found no touch DNA. Nobody's DNA was on her clothes.
Today.
Yeah,
Like
today.
they present day.
And that's because they're out in the elements and all that. It's the worst conditions to preserve that kind of DNA. There's like a 28-day half-life, like out in the elements, and weather and all these things can affect it. So they didn't find it. So then they tested a pair of shoes in her car. Now I've seen the crime scene photos of her car, and a lot of people spot these like Nike shoes that are in a lot of the photos. Those weren't the shoes that were tested. There are some dress shoes somewhere in the car, possibly in a box somewhere, that she probably, and when I say probably, I mean definitely wasn't wearing that day that they tested. And what they found on those shoes was 4 DNA profiles, none of which match Adnan Syed. Now, this is incredibly sinister for a number
Yeah.
of reasons. One, Adnan is the ex-boyfriend of Hay. So the way they explain away the fingerprints when they address it, which is almost never, is that, well, Adnan was her boyfriend, so of course he touched things in her car. So if they would have found his DNA, they would have said, well, Adnan was her ex-boyfriend, so of course he would have been in the car. So the DNA
Yes.
could not have proven Adnan guilty. So like, let's get that out of the way right away. The second thing is that if you go to any class and you learn forensics, it's actually a little experiment that they do where they swab the bottom of your shoes to find how many DNA profiles you come into contact with, because people leave biological material everywhere. So the fact that Heyman Lee might have stepped on some spit or something like that does not mean that there are four real killers in this
Yes.
case. Like it's like if you said OJ Simpson, like they tested the shoes in Nicole Brown Simpson's car and they found real killers in the OJ Simpson case. Like that's not how they work. DNA doesn't come with this time, doesn't come with the timestamp. So there's no way of knowing when this DNA would have got there. There's no reason to believe that Adnan would have touched her shoes in his strangulation of her. So that doesn't make any sense. And there's no evidence that these shoes were on her feet at all. They were in her car. They were dress shoes that she probably wasn't wearing based on the weather and the fact that it was just, a random day in January. So none of this made any sense. So I joke that they should have just tested shoes that she kept in her room,
Yeah.
because think about how many more real killers they would have found if they
Right.
would have done that.
Right. We went to her closet. We've tested all the shoes. We found 100 DNA profiles. Let's investigate all these people. You're exactly right. Most of the people who are saying this, they're getting it. It's the same way that the media tells us what to think about politics. A lot of the articles related to him, and anybody who's listening, you can go look up DNA evidence and Adnan Syed. You read the articles. It took me forever to actually find a piece that mentioned what was tested. The
Yeah.
articles, all they say is DNA evidence cleared him. Okay, I guess I'm just gonna go with that. Like, don't you want to know what they like what DNA you're talking about, where it came from, what was tested? Like, no.
Well, and DNA sounds super scientific, and like, if this were like a rape and murder case and they tested like the semen because they're like, oh, the person who raped her definitely killed her, then you would have something. But this is a
Right.
strangulation with no evidence of sexual assault. And they claim there's two alternative suspects, and this is what the Brady violations come from.
Okay.
The DNA doesn't match either alternative suspect because they're already in jail. All they would have to do is put it into CODIS and it would ping either one of those suspects. So, or alleged suspects.
Okay, explain that. I don't know what a Brady violation is.
So a Brady violation, it comes from a Supreme Court case called Brady versus, I don't remember, but it basically, you're required as the prosecution to turn over exculpatory evidence to the defense. So the argument for his initial release before the DNA testing was done was that they found evidence that the prosecution failed to turn over to the defense, right? And among this evidence were two alternative suspects.
Right.
However, this is not the case. Like, it's just not true that they didn't turn over this evidence. And one of the reasons why it's true is not true is that one of the alternative suspects is a man called Alonzo Sellers. He's the person who found the body. Like,
Mm.
obviously, they suspected the person who called and said, I found a dead body here.
In fact,
And
they questioned him on the stand.
yes, he was he was not only available to the defense, he testified at the trial. So Alonzo Sellers is like, the idea that he was a hidden alternative suspect makes no sense. Also, he had no motivation to kill Heyman Lee. Also, this doesn't explain how Jay and Jen knew that she was strangled and buried that day. It doesn't explain how Jay knew where Heyman Lee's car was. There's no connection between Jay and Alonzo Sellers. So he has nothing to do with anything.
Yeah.
Then there's the second supposed alternative suspect, which is a guy called Bilal Ahmed, who's a really shady dentist and honestly brings a whole new angle to this case in his relationship with Adnan, because this was a guy who liked young boys.
Mm.
And he has history of being caught in compromising positions with minors. He has a history of sexually assaulting his patients as a dentist, where he would knock them out and do things to them. So he has a whole bunch of problems, but all of his problems are related to men and boys. So like they'll say, oh, he has a history of sexual assault, even though there's no sexual assault in the Heyman Lee case, and he would sexually assault boys or men. So,
Yeah.
like, he has a whole bunch of problems, but he's Adnan's close friend at the mosque and mentor. So, any motivation he would have had to kill Heyman Lee would have come from his relationship with Adnan. But more importantly, the threat that they say that this guy made, when you look at the actual handwritten note where they say they got this from, it's from his wife, most likely, Bilal's wife. And according to the guy who wrote the note, she was describing a threat that Adnan had made against Heyman Lee, not that this guy made.
Wow. Okay. I didn't know that part. I have to read
So
more
and
about
and
that one.
remember the prosecution, the current prosecution, which is really just a second defense team, never asked Urich, the author of this note, about this note, like who he meant when he wrote he threatened to kill Heyman Lee or anything like that. So if they really wanted to know whether or not there was a Brady violation, first of all, it's really weird to claim a Brady violation when you found this in the case file. So if they really wanted to know if there was a Brady violation, they would have contacted the person who wrote the note who was available and asked them a basic question. What they were doing was looking for any excuse to free Adnan. So those are the two supposed Brady violations. They're all documents that were found in the case file, so they were available to the defense. That's how they found them. And one of them is a threat from Adnan, not from this other guy. And the other one is the guy who found the body that everybody knew was a suspect. He was the first suspect, and he testified at trial, meaning the defense could have tried to point the finger at him at trial.
Mhm. Can we talk about a little bit about what's been done to, because the other thing that I like that you do is you always bring the focus back in your videos to the victim and the victims' families. And that's one of, I think, there's so many things wrong with advocating on behalf of convicted murderers when they're guilty. But one of them, I think, is the disrespect shown to and the almost necessary demonization that they have to engage in of the victim and the victim's family. Can you talk about what this has done to the Heyman Lee family?
So, like, just like a little background, Heyman Lee's family, they're Korean, and none of her direct relatives, except for her younger brother, speak English. So they really have no chance to advocate in the same way that Adnan's group does. So they so what they do, and this is really nefarious in the HBO docu series, is essentially try to portray not only Heyman Lee's family as not caring about her, but they try to portray the Korean community as not caring about Heyman Lee to essentially make the case that Adnan was the only one who really cared about her, which is really nasty considering like they lost their daughter. And when you actually hear Heyman Lee's mother talk about how her whole family died the day that they found her body and all of that, it's just disgusting. And of course, the family doesn't have a media apparatus. They don't have a campaign. They don't have an NPR voiced Sarah Koenig to advocate for them. So they're just up against it. And one of the things that they do in the documentary is Adnan shares a supposed abuse story from when Heyman Lee was back in Korea and makes it seem like the family took the side of the abuser against Heyman Lee. So, but Adnan was the only one who cared about this abuse story. Now, even if Heyman Lee told him that in confidence, like the idea that he would use that to paint him as a great guy is disgusting. And I don't know if that's actually true because, again, it comes from Adnan, who has every reason to lie about this. But it even goes one step further than that. So the Innocence Project and Rabia and all these people are going off this idea that maybe the police even framed Adnan for unknown reasons. And during the after the family filed an appeal because their rights were violated under the victim rights statute, which allowed them to be in court in the same manner as the defendant when they freed Adnan, the filmmaker behind the case against Adnan Syed, a woman called Amy Berg, actually tweeted out, and she knows this is false, that Heyman Lee's younger brother, the one person that speaks English, may have called in the anonymous tip. And considering they frame this as the people involved in this case framed Adnan Syed for Heyman Lee's murder, She's making the case that Heyman Lee's younger brother framed Adnan Syed for no reason for Adnan's murder. So she's just targeting this guy who lost his sister for harassment. And the anonymous tip, the police know who it was, but there's anonymous tip protection laws, so they don't reveal who it was. But they know who it was. It's somebody that was clearly one of Adnan's friends,
Yeah.
because this person knew where Adnan used to hook up with Heyman Lee. Not something you typically tell your little brother, especially when you're not allowed to date somebody while you're in high school. And for her to spin that into an attack on young Lee just because he wants to be heard on this case involving his sister is absurd and incredibly nasty. Not to mention what they do to the Korean community.
It was filthy. I mean, anybody who's not familiar with these details that Sean's talking about, there was an anonymous tip. It was a male with an Asian accent. That's all we know about the tipster. But what they said,
age, no, we know age 18 to 21 as well.
Oh, 18 to 21, and her brother was younger. This tipster knew the names of Adnan's friends. He knew, as you mentioned, where Adnan would go, like hook up spots with her to make out with her. It was clearly someone who knew Adnan, who was in his circle of friends, and it was someone older. And yeah, I thought that was one of the most despicable things I saw, is the director of that HBO documentary saying maybe the tipster was her little brother, when they all know that. I mean, they make a point of it in the documentary that like she had to hide her relationship from her family and had to date secretly. And it's like, why would her little brother? I just thought it was so gratuitous.
Yes.
To do. So yeah. So all of that being said, one of the people, the person you mentioned who's the most instrumental in launching this whole Innocence Project campaign around Adnan and, leading to his release, was Rabia Chaudhry. She's become famous off of it. She's made a lot of money off of it. And now you in one of your videos, I was cracking up where you showed her like promo campaign for her new series with this Broadway person I'd never heard of,
Yeah.
Ellen somebody. And it's the two of them. You guys, they have a new podcast. And this one's not just about Adnan. This one is about every episode's going to be a different murderer that they're trying to get released. And they did this splash sizzle reel for it, where they're, on the streets of New York or somewhere, I don't know, in their high heels. And it's all like, this is going to be a fun ride, come to our show. First episode of the show. First of all, before I even say that, here's a problem with this. She's created a brand off of freeing convicted murderers. So she has to find more salacious cases for every episode of convicted murderers to make you question, is this person really innocent? Which is automatically, there's an incentive there to cover people who maybe you don't have that many doubts about, but man, you're going to try and stretch it and find them because you got to have a new episode out, right? First episode, Scott Peterson. I'd listen to it. I know you haven't listened to it, right?
No, I have not.
Okay, let me just tell you my thoughts, because I think this gets to what's wrong with this. Even being as skeptical as I am, going into it thinking Rabia is a con artist, knowing what I do about the facts that she's left out of the Adnan Syed case, I listened to their first episode about Scott Peterson, and I came away thinking, wow, maybe Scott Peterson's innocent. It actually moved me into the I'm not sure camp. It was compelling. It was emotionally, all those things. It caught me. I was like, wow, I didn't know that. Oh my goodness. And so I spent a few days. I was like, I guess I have to investigate the Scott Peterson case now. Maybe I'm entirely wrong. And lo and behold, then I did some reading. Your friend Roberta Glass, who has a true crime podcast, she sent me some stuff to read, and lo and behold, they left out all of this information, all of these facts, which once I read them, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that explains that. And why not include that if you're looking for the truth, right? Why not include those damning facts?
Yeah, I mean, you just say there's no evidence, and you prove that there's no evidence by never presenting any of the evidence.
Yeah.
And most people aren't going to check because, it's a show, it's entertainment. It's actually beyond entertainment because it's not just like you watch or listen passively, but you get to join a movement, become a part of a team and all
Yeah.
that. So it's like it's like the evolution of the genre. Like you're getting to participate in it. And like I don't know if this was in the podcast, but I had a friend send me this because she was talking about this before with the Scott Peterson case. So in that case, he said at one point that on the day of the murder that he was at the golf course, but it was raining really heavily. So it's like you were playing golf in the rain. He then changed that to say that he was at this like pier, like fishing out on this body of water.
Hmm.
That's where they found her body, like that body of water, right? So Rabia says that she believes Scott Peterson, even though his alibi is stupid. It actually inadvertently, well, not in it places him at the scene of the crime, but that's what happens when you're put on the spot and you have to change your story. But she's like, it's such a stupid and bad alibi that it can't be made up because if it was made up, it would be a better alibi.
I don't remember if she said that specifically in the podcast, but that's great.
This was out
It's like
this was
this.
out before the podcast. Like
Okay,
that's how ridiculous these people work. And for some people, that sounds like perfectly reasonable.
but that's also like that's what your point about testing the DNA in the shoes is. It's a Kafka trap. Like if they had come back after they tested those high heels or those dress shoes in her car in Adnan Syed case, if they had found DNA, they would have said, "Oh, he's still not guilty because of course his DNA is on it. He's her boyfriend." If they didn't find DNA, then they say, "Oh, look, see, he's innocent. There's not DNA." Either way, they're going to say whatever the result is, he's innocent. And that's the same thing with these alibis is, "Oh, well, he's not anywhere near the crime scene, so he couldn't have done it." "Oh, he's at the crime scene." Well, he must not have done it because who would say they're at the crime scene? Like it's he's
He
innocent either way.
Yeah. Well, he also Googled like how like tides, drag stuff or whatever, like before the murder. And like the reason she took this case is because the Scott Peterson case, you've seen the movie Gone Girl, right?
Hmm.
A lot of Gone Girl is modeled after a book
Yes,
that was modeled after this specific
I
case. That's
love the
why
book. Yeah.
yeah, that's why Ben Affleck kind of looks like he's
Hmm.
depicted to look like this guy.
Yeah.
So it's already a high profile case. That's why she's giving it the attention. And based on what she did with the Adnan Syed case, making that one of the most high profile cases, it kind of started the true crime genre. Like she's just trying to continuously profit off of this kind of genre. So like
So
if Scott Peterson's guilty, then Rabia doesn't make any money. Like she makes money off of innocence. She makes money off of creating ambiguity where there is not. Like remember, like Adnan, the jury convicted him in 2 hours. Like there's evidence was overwhelming. But that's not an interesting story. But if you throw in a little ambiguity there or you take the alternative position, then people get interested.
yes. One of the things that really made me think, when I listened to that episode about Scott Peterson was they were saying, "Look, um, the morning that she went missing, she was on the computer. She couldn't have been dead because she was on the computer and she was searching for a sunflower umbrella. And, people knew that she loved sunflowers and so that couldn't have been Scott Peterson. It must have been her. And I was thinking, wow, well, I guess she was on the computer that morning and the timeline's different now and everything. What they did not include in the podcast, this was just one of many things that I read afterwards, is they showed that that was not a search. There was nobody typing into the search bar sunflower umbrellas. It was a Yahoo ad, and it was a little bit of data that pops up that you saw an image while he was checking his email. So Scott Peterson's checking his Scott Peterson email, and then a couple minutes later, there's a few different Yahoo ads while he's in his Yahoo email, images for things that showed up, one of which was a sunflower umbrella. There was no search for it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, little things like that. I'm like, why can't you just tell me that as the listener instead of trying to be like, "Ooh, there was a search," and instead of trying to present it in a way where I have a certain opinion, just give me the bare facts so I can make up my own mind.
Devin Tracy, Atheism is Unstoppable, has a great line about this. He's like, the problem with the court of public opinion is that it's not a court. Like
Mhm.
all of this stuff, like you could just lie and bring in all this stuff that is not evidence. If you try to say that there was a search for this, they would look at the evidence, and you would not even be able to present that in before a jury because it's just objectively not true. Like
Yeah.
that, so it's just it's absurd. And but that's the thing is, like, if you're Rabia, lying has only benefited you like throughout your career, lying about these cases, because it's not like she has to file actual appeals. Like anytime anything she's been related to has filed anything in court, they've been obliterated because what they're filing is sometimes just false information, altered transcripts. Like they've been caught doing that for the Adnan case. So I'm pretty sure if she gets her legal teams or her friends, they'll do the same thing in the Peterson case. But like you
By
don't
the
have to worry about
by
what
the way,
happened.
she said that at the end of the episode. She said, "I'm willing, and anybody from Scott Peterson's team, I'm willing to work with you. Let me know."
Yeah, and that's the thing is like there's no downside for her because she doesn't have to perjure herself or do anything like that. Like Robbie is the same woman who said that the lividity proved that Heyman Lee was not murdered in the timeline that they said she was murdered. And she slices out a small excerpt of of the autopsy report, and you read that excerpt, it doesn't say anything close to what she's saying. So she's just extrapolating something based on that excerpt. But in the next paragraph, they describe livor mortis, which is lividity. You can look it up. It's the same thing. They just use two different words. One paragraph later, it totally debunks everything that she says. She still makes the lividity argument from time to time. And it's like, no, the lividity actually fully supports the case, and she was able to run wild with that for weeks because the state doesn't have a propaganda operation. They have to file and release everything in an appropriate way. So this is what she does. She goes into the files, finds little things like that Yahoo ad, makes it a Yahoo search, and all of a sudden, like, oh look, she was alive at this time. So the timeline doesn't work. Therefore, Scott
Yeah.
Peterson's innocent. And
Yeah.
like that's the game.
AH
Oh,
AH has the word I was looking for. It's a cookie. It's like when there's a cookie left behind in your data when something pops up on your screen.
yeah.
Sorry.
I thought he was referencing Julius Jones's ridiculous alibi that he was eating a big cookie at the time.
Wait, what? I don't know. I don't
Yeah.
know that one.
But yeah, like it's very tragic to see this kind of thing happen. And one of the things that you'll know, like one of the reasons I feel like Robbie is lying, like she's not stupid, right? But she could, there's like a way to be like willfully ignorant or willfully blind. But one of the reasons why I feel like she's lying is that in the Adnan case, and I'm sure this will happen with the Peterson case, she only takes a suspect as far as it can go before they fall apart. Like if you watch that HBO, the case against Adnan Syed, like they vaguely allude that maybe Jay did it. They vaguely allude that maybe Alonzo Sellers did it. Like this is what they do. They vaguely allude that maybe Don did it.
Mhm.
Like, but the fact is none of those suspects work at all. And if you look into them anymore, you'll realize that they're completely eliminatable. And then you're left with Adnan Syed. So she just throws out little bait about maybe it was this person, maybe it was that person. She never actually points the finger or takes an affirmative position, and that's part of her strategy.
Yeah. I mean, in the case with Adnan, it's like one final thing I'll say that I've heard people say in the innocence echo chamber is, you know, you have to convict without reasonable doubt, and there's definitely reasonable doubt here. Yeah, Laura, she says they are all about casting reasonable doubt. The thing is, it would require unreasonable doubt, in my opinion, to look at all the evidence against Adnan, the fact that his cell phone was pinging off from the burial site at the exact time she was being buried, the fact that his cell phone was pinging from the car dump site right when the car would have been dumped, the fact that his friend who helped him bury her that night told other people, hey, this happened, he strangled her, the fact that friend knew where the car dump was, the cops didn't know where the car was until that friend, all of these things, the fact that he told the police that day when they questioned him, yeah, I asked her for a ride, and then later changed the story and said he never asked her for a ride, that there were other friends who heard him ask for a ride, all of these things, the letter where he wrote I will kill at the top when she was like, leave me alone, dude, like we broke up, life goes on. You would have to have just unreasonable doubt to think all of these things are just coincidence. just coincidence, and there's got to be someone else who fits, who has more coincidences than this, who fits up with with the case.
You would have to believe, like, there to me, there's no doubt for Adnan in the
Yeah.
Heyman Lee case. You would have to believe that Jay Wilds killed her
Yeah.
with a second accomplice who Jay never turned in, who was never discovered because this person is just a phantom person, because it was a two-person job. There were two cars involved. There's all these other issues. Coincidentally, the day that Jay decided to kill Heyman Lee, who he didn't know, Adnan lent him, because it was Jay's girlfriend's birthday, his cell phone in his car. And then Jay decided to frame Adnan by telling little tidbits of information to his friends, and then they were able to do that. Or you think that Jay was somehow framed himself, because he also framed himself as the accomplice in that scenario,
Yeah.
and could have been facing just as much time as Adnan.
Yeah.
So or you end up with Jay had nothing to do with it, and he psychically knew where the car was dumped. He psychically knew that or told the cops that the churn signal was damaged, even though it was the windshield wiper on the opposite side. And he knew like that she was buried in the park, and he told people that she was strangled and all these other things. Like it, and he knew that the cell phone data would corroborate the story that he would give to the police.
Yeah.
Like it's impossible
It's
for it to
impossible.
not be Adnan.
Yeah. Why do you think, what is it that's driving people to it's sort of like a mass formation. It's not exactly the same, but we've talked about politics recently in the past couple of years. People have talked about this theory of mass formation psychosis or whatever. What is driving the attraction? What's the attraction for getting in these Innocence Project campaigns and advocating on behalf of murderers?
Well, it's like a community thing. So you get to join a team, you get to advocate the same talking points, you get to work towards a cause and all that. There's celebrity appeal. Kim Kardashian has weighed in on I don't know about the Scott Peterson case, but I wouldn't be surprised on like the Adnan case and other cases that I mentioned. So they get attention. There's
Julius
also
Jones.
yeah, Julius Jones, Rodney Reed, like the Chino Hills massacre, like all the ones that I mentioned, except for maybe Scott Peterson. There's the idea that you're fighting back against the system, but or like that conspiracy appeal where like you feel superior because you can see what other people can't see, like you have the knowledge and all that. There's also the fact that women are just obsessed with true crime. Like it's just scientific fact that every woman loves true crime.
This is
And
true.
so like you have like built in over half the population as an audience. And it's the natural evolution of watching the OJ Simpson trial or watching all this true crime stuff on TV, that you'd want to get involved or like come up with your own theories for the mystery and all that those theories could then have impact on the case. So like there's a desire to be right. So it's a combination of a bunch of different things, and also very well motivated activists who want to undermine the criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And they realize that innocence is far more effective than you're going too hard against these criminals that are definitely guilty and honestly very monstrous.
Yeah. I think people also they like you said, being a part of it and finding the true killer. And it's actually it's not the person that all the evidence points towards. It's actually a mystery that we must figure out. I noticed this when I was on a jury. This was years ago when I still lived in California. And this was a jury for a very clear-cut, open and shut DUI and DWI case. Okay. This guy, I can't even remember what his blood alcohol was, but it was crazy high. He was swerving. He was, he took tests, different tests. He took the breathalyzer at the side of the road, and then he took the even more accurate breathalyzer, the big machine in the once he got to the sheriff's office. So it was open and shut, but he had a lot of money. And it was weird. He was from Texas, but he was living in California, and he clearly had a lot of money to fight this, to try. I guess he had other convictions and was trying not to have this on his record. So he actually took it to court, and I couldn't believe I was on a jury for an open and shut DUI, DWI case. So after listening to all this stupid testimony in which he got up on the stand and said that the reason he blew the same number high number on both different tests was because that he had eaten a lot of green beans that day and had a lot of gas and was burping, which makes no sense. There's nothing that says, well, I ate green beans, therefore I'm going to fail the breathalyzer test. But that was his excuse. So after all of that, we go into deliberations, and I'm thinking this will be 5 minutes, and we're like, guilty. Oh, no. We deliberated for like 3 days, and then ultimately it was a hung jury because there were people on the jury that really wanted him to be innocent and really wanted there to be a mystery and really wanted there to be wrongdoing on behalf of the cops. And I mean, there were people in the jury room who were like, well, I know they put that scientist up there, but I don't trust science. And I was like, okay, so they're like, we have to find what really happened here. And it was weird, Sean, because he was charged with 3 things, the DUI, the DWI, and the third one was he had lived in California for a number of years and did not have a California driver's license. So he was there's some kind of thing on the books there where he was guilty of having lived there for a certain amount of time without getting the driver's license. He pled guilty to that charge. And they actually, my jury was like, sent a request to the judge to find if we could still find him innocent on that charge too. Even though he had pled guilty, it was like, there was some weird driving force of wanting to be on something, I don't know, like mysterious and where there's more digging to be done. Do you think that's part of it?
And that's like and that's like a inconsequential case where he probably wouldn't have served jail time
Yeah.
anyway. So like, but yeah, no, it's 12 Angry Men, like what you're
Yeah.
describing.
Yes.
Like it's like these people think that that's a blueprint. Like I always say that, like when you think about a jury, like think about the 12 dumbest people you know, and think about whether or not you can get them to agree to something stupid.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
so like juries, unless there's forensic evidence in modern juries, like DNA or something, like you could trot out an expert or whatever, like that makes them feel dumb in comparison to like the person, like they're not convicting because we've trained up the people to think that, oh, you need all this overwhelming forensic
Yes.
evidence and all that. So yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, if you figure like a DWI is like so obvious,
So
but
obvious. Let me tell you, that judge, I will never forget, because when we came back in the courtroom and he was like, we have a hung jury. Everyone was like, really? Like, it's like, yeah, because people wanted to be part of something big where they figure out, aha, it's not what is obvious. It's something not obvious.
yeah.
So, thank you for being here with me today. I really just, I've had a bug up my butt about the Adnan case. I want to thank you for introducing me to the concept of innocence fraud, and also for all the work you've done, like I said, advocating on behalf of victims' families. And tell people where they can find you if they're not already familiar with you.
You can find me on YouTube at the Actual Justice Warrior. I'm also on Twitter at I am Sean 90. I'm on Instagram at Actual Justice. I recently moved my backlog to Odyssey and to Rumble, which, by the way, Keri, you should definitely do it. They
Okay.
copy it for you. Like,
I am doing, I don't know about my backlog, but I know that my videos go up on Rumble and Odyssey, and I never plug it. You guys should, if you're on Rumble and Odyssey, that's where we'll all eventually be, probably, because we'll get banned one day. So
do the Rumble for the backlog. It
okay,
works.
cool. Thank
And
you.
so does Odyssey. I think the Odyssey backlog works better. But yeah, you can find me there. I'm on Minds at Actual Justice Warrior. Like you should be able to find me at Actual Justice or at Actual Justice Warrior on almost anything. But on Twitter, it's at I am Sean 90.
Cool. Thank you, Sean. Will you come back next time there's a case where I get really angry and talk and give us all the facts?
Just wait for the Supreme Court to rule on the Rodney Reed case.
Okay. I don't know anything about that one. I'm going to start reading. You guys, thanks for hanging out with us today. Pirate Tomsky in the chat says smash the like button. Oh wait, one other comment from Murder Knits. If you don't know Tabitha, she does a great true crime and knitting podcast. She says her answer to why are people getting involved in these innocence fraud campaigns is the same reason why women write to men in prison and then marry them. Yeah, I think there's something there. Cool. Thank you guys. Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.